Hey there, darling. Welcome to the Farmer's Table. I'm Jess, and I'm so glad you're here today. I'm going to be doing a video today after a little bit of a break. I had a bit of a Thanksgiving cooking hangover and took a few days off, not just from making cooking videos, but from cooking altogether. We ate a lot of leftovers and then had a couple of days where it was chopped kitchen. I'm just throwing something fast together. But today I am back with what I think might be the most requested recipe that I've had since starting this channel. And that is for a good sandwich bread recipe. Now, whenever I first started learning to cook from scratch, learning to make bread was kind of at the top of the list. And I made a lot of breads. I'd tried lots of different recipes, some of which were great successes and some of which were great failures. But I had never quite found the perfect sandwich bread recipe. And this is just a simple bread recipe that is plain, that picky kids are not going to turn their nose up at, and that most importantly can be easily sliced to be able to make sandwiches. So many bread recipes are really crumbly, and whenever you go to slice them they just kind of disintegrate into crumbs, which obviously is not going to work when we're trying to make a sandwich for a school lunch. 5-ish years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, my friend Amanda Palladini actually shared her favorite sandwich bread recipe with me that she routinely made for her children's school lunches, and I tried it and it ended the search for me. It is hands down the best sandwich bread recipe I have ever tried. So I'm very thankful to Amanda. Her channel is Welcome Grove Homestead, and she shares a lot from their homestead, which is now located in East Tennessee. So we can all thank Amanda for ending our search for the perfect sandwich bread recipe. Today I'm going to be making this with my KitchenAid mixture. With any bread recipe like this, you can make it by hand. You're just going to need to knead it more. It's going to take a little bit more muscle. This is honestly the kind of task that I'm usually running as a side job in my kitchen. Usually my focus is on something else, and I get the bread started, I get it going so it can rise the first time and then the second time and bake. It's never the main thing that I'm doing because you do have these large chunks of like downtime that you're not hands-on. I do also have a bread machine. I will do a separate video showing my bread machine and the recipe that I do there. Because bread is one thing that I really hate buying from the store. The number one reason is that it is full of all kinds of preservatives and chemical ingredients that I do not like purchasing. It has a lot of growth inhibitors to keep mold from growing. And more than that, if you want to buy a quality bread, so if you decide to read the ingredient labels and try to buy the best bread on the shelf, it still has stuff in it I don't love. It's like $7 a loaf, which is insane to have to pay that much for something that you can literally make for less than $1 a loaf at home. Probably even less than that, actually, if you're buying your ingredients in bulk. As usual, I'm going to have the principal recipe down in the show notes. It will say Amanda's best bread recipe, and you can click on that, print it out so that you have it for easy reference. Whenever I start talking to people about cooking from scratch and cutting down their grocery budget, it is always my suggestion to start, if you consume bread products, by making them at home. You can control so much more what goes into them, but again, it is just such a way to save money. All right, so I'm going to start by putting 3 cups of flour in this bowl. Side note, I do buy my flour bulk, and I get these big food safe containers at a restaurant supply store, and this is what I keep flour and sugar, actually multiple staples. I'm going to add 2.5 teaspoons of salt. You'll see my measuring spoons for salt, and 1.5 tablespoons of instant yeast. Now I keep my yeast in an airtight jar in the freezer. I pull it out for recipes and then stick it right back in there. That's going to make sure that it stays fresh longer. If your yeast is old, your bread will not rise properly. So you want to make sure that you're working with fresh yeast. And here you can use a 1/4 cup of honey or sugar. Maple syrup works well for this as well. I have used that when I'm in a pinch. Today I'm using honey. I usually use honey. And now I want to add 2 3/4 cups, like very warm water. Now we do not want this to be boiling. You don't need to turn on the kettle or anything. You want it to be where you can comfortably put your fingers underneath it. We don't want it burning hot. That will damage our yeast, but we also do need it to be warm enough to activate the yeast. Now for most baking, I prefer recipes that do weights instead of measurements, but I can tell you with this bread recipe, things like very warm water and these cups and different measurements, it's not super exact, and this bread has always turned out well for me, so I'm just gonna stick with sharing it that way. And next, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of oil, and you wanna do a neutral oil here. So I'm using avocado oil today. Sometimes I'll melt down lard. I have melted down butter for this before. And we want to give this a little mix. You're not trying to like thoroughly combine all of these ingredients. You could run the bread hook, but I find it just does better to use something like a spoon or a spatula to make sure that you don't have like big clumps of flour in the bottom. And we're gonna give this a mix. It's gonna be real runny, and we're gonna let this sit for about 10 minutes, and it's gonna start getting bubbly, and that yeast with that warm water and the honey is going to start activating. We'll be back in 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, see this nice bubbly activated yeast going on here in this mixture. It's looking exactly how I expect, and you can kind of see that I did not really thoroughly mix that. There's little bits of flour, which is fine. Now, this recipe calls for a total of 6.5 to 7.5 cups of flour to make these 2 loaves of bread. We already put 3 in the bowl, meaning from here, we're going to begin by adding 3.5 more, and then from there, we are going to add another cup if it's needed. Now, there is a little bit of nuance when it comes to cooking and baking, and I can tell you some things to look for, but it may be a little different every time when it comes down to something like this. Now, I cannot tell you the science that goes into this. I'm sure somebody could that knows more than I do. I don't know what makes it work the way that it does, but I know that sometimes it's raining outside and that changes how the bread works. Sometimes I'm using different flour from a different maker and it changes how the bread works. I want to give you a touch of encouragement if you are just getting into cooking. As people who are afraid to fail, we have a tendency to just immediately say, oh, I'm so bad at that, I'm such a bad cook. Oh, I tried to bake bread, but I'm really bad at it. You're not practiced. And I'm really bad at cutting hair because I have never learned. And it's one of those things that I accept the fact that I do not know how to do it, and I pay someone else to do it for me. And unfortunately, because so many people have taken that route in cooking, our food system is what it is today. You don't have to keep paying somebody else to bake your bread for you. You're just gonna have to learn how to do it. So we're gonna start with 3.5 cups, and we're gonna see how that goes. And if you start with 3.5 cups and you end up making your bread and it's not the best bread you've ever had, make it again, and make it again, and make it again, until eventually you know exactly what your dough is supposed to look like to be what you want. All right, we're gonna turn this on medium low. I don't wanna go too high because I'm not trying to paint my, my kitchen with flour. If you are ever measuring flour, it's best to make sure your flour is nice and loose. This is one of the reasons why I like weighing recipes. But you don't ever want to like pack it in. We want it to be good and loose. So I'm always scooping my flour up. It's another reason why I like to work with flour out of the big tub like this, because I can make sure I'm not compacting my scoop. All right, back to adding. Okay, I've got 7 cups of flour total in here. I'm going to scrape this down and make sure that all the flour is getting incorporated. Depending on your mixer, you may need to scrape up down to the bottom to make sure there's not a pocket of flour down there. That can happen sometimes. I'm going to add that last little bit. At 7.5 cups, my dough really wasn't coming together like I like to see. It wasn't beginning to pull away from the sides. It was still really goopy. So I went ahead and added a whole other cup of flour. This brought me up to a grand total of 8.5 cups. This is going to be something you have to play with if you're using a recipe that does not call for weights. And this is a knowledge that can be applied no matter what baking recipe you're doing. If you're making any sort of bread, you want to make sure that you are forming a proper dough. So with 8.5 cups of flour, I want this mixture to knead for at least 3 minutes until it stops tearing and the dough begins to look smooth. Into the bowl without recording. So you want to scrape it out. I used a little spatula and scrape it out into a greased bowl that is large enough for the dough to double in size. You can see I've got this. You can spray it, you can rub butter in it, whatever you're gonna do. Just make sure that it's well oiled. If you are going to cover this with plastic wrap, go ahead and oil your plastic wrap as well in case it rises up and touches it so that it doesn't tear a bunch of it away. I always just use a big kitchen towel, and I always use a bowl that has enough space that it probably isn't going to touch the kitchen towel. So this first rise is going to take roughly an hour. We are looking for this dough to double in size. So I'm going to set my timer for, I'm going to start at like 50 minutes and take a look at it. Now, a note about bread rising: if your house is really cold, your bread is not going to rise as well. There are a couple of options here. You can put the bowl like up on the top of your fridge where it may be a little bit warmer. You can stick it in like the oven or the microwave. Don't turn them on, but where it may be just a little bit warmer than out in like a drafty part of your kitchen. And one thing I have seen people do is take like a string of Christmas lights or a warming pad and all of these different things. That's never really been necessary for me. We keep our house, you know, roughly 68-ish degrees, like in the winter right now. There's like 24 Celsius. I mean, it's like, it's warmish in here. It's not by any means super warm, but it's definitely warmish. It may take a little bit longer. That's really the thing. It'll still rise. It's just going to take a little bit longer. So I'm going to take a look at it in 50 minutes and see where we're at. And I expect it probably will have doubled by then. We want to go ahead and prepare 2 loaf pans by oiling them. I use these stoneware Pampered Chef loaf pans. It's what I've baked bread in for a long time, but you can use glass. If all you have is a metal pan, you can use a metal pan. You are going to get a harder crust that way. I prefer the stoneware or glass because you do get softer crusts, which is typically what we're looking for in like a sandwich bread. But the best pan is the one you have. So just get them greased up and ready for this bread to rise. All right, guys, it's been about 55 minutes and my dough has doubled. It looks really lovely. Smells really nice and yeasty. And here I'm going to show you what I do as far as separating this out and putting in the pan. So first we're gonna punch our dough down, the most satisfying part of bread making, which lets all the air out. And at this point, some people will tell you to turn this out onto like a floured surface and work it. I don't want to have to clean my counters. I want less things to wash in my life, not more. So I just take it and roll it around a few times in this greased pan. I pick this loaf up and I break this dough roughly in half. Usually I don't do a very exact job. Pinch it like this and drop it down into my pans. This would have been better had I put some oil on my hands. I'm gonna do that for the next one. All right, a little bit of oil on my hands. Grab the next loaf and I just wanna shape it so that's gonna be smooth on top. Take the pinched area, put it down. I did not do these very evenly. I do better sometimes than others. This is not advised. I'm going to pinch a little bit of this off, add it to the bottom of this one, and there I have my 2 loaves. You basically just want to take that dough and separate it into 2 loaf pans. Sometimes I am tempted when I am making tutorial videos to not do stuff like that because I want to show you the proper way. I want to show you the fail-proof way. I want to show you what everybody else shows you. But the truth is, that is how I put my bread in the pans every single time because I don't want to flour the surface. I don't want to have to scrape the flour off. I don't want to have to clean it. So I do it like this, and sometimes I end up with a little bit uneven loaves, but whenever I make my kids sandwiches out of this bread, they don't complain that maybe sometimes one slice is a little bit bigger than the other one. All right, now we're going to preheat our oven to 350 and begin our second rise. Now, this time I'm going to actually wet this towel. All right, I got this damp. It is not sopping wet. It's not gonna get my loaves wet, but I did want to put the damp towel over here for this second rise, just so this dough is less likely to stick to it. About 30 minutes on the timer. Basically, I want to see this bread rise up over the top of these pans. I would say it's probably going to double again, and then as soon as that happens, we're going to put it in the oven. Roughly 30-35 minutes later, I just pulled the towel off of my risen dough. You want to make sure your dough is up over the top of your pan. it's going to rise a little bit further in the oven. You do need to be careful with it when you're handling at this point, because if you poke a hole in it, you remember when we punched it down, it let all the air out of it. We don't want to do that right now because we don't want to stop the rising. You can definitely overproof this or over rise it, where you let it sit too long and it will fall at that point. If you let it rise too much and you stick it in the oven and it rises further, you'll have loaves of bread that are like this tall. We don't really want that either. We end up with big air bubbles when we do that. So I kind of tend to err on the side of less rising. As long as it's up over the top, I consider that risen enough to stick it in the oven. It's going to rise a little bit more. I want this to fit in a bag, the sandwich. So I kind of err on this side. You've got probably about a 30-minute window here where it's still going to be fine either way. But this is when I like to put mine in the oven, right when it's just maybe an inch over the top, if that. You could let it go a little further. Again, this is going to come down to your preference. I like to put them in the middle of the oven. You don't want them too close to the top because they are going to rise further in the oven, and we don't want them to touch the top of the oven. So I like to go right in the middle. 30 minutes, 350 degree oven. I'll see you then. Okay, so 32 minutes later, my bread is out. I'm going to take some butter really quick. Go along the top with this butter. It would have been better to melt this and just brush it on, but you know, the best laid plans. My kids are home now, and so I am distracted. And I'm gonna stick these back in the oven for like a minute, just so this will brown. Here's my bread. It's out of the oven. We typically wanna let this cool to be able to slice it for sandwiches. My kids are here now, and they just got home from school, so we're gonna go ahead and slice into one of these now. It's gonna let a lot of steam out, and I think that technically that may make the remaining loaf stale faster. However, fresh baked bread just never really lasts long enough to go stale here. You have a couple of options here. You can keep it in like an airtight bag once it's completely cool. Do not put it into an airtight bag when it's still hot, or the steam will make it soggy. Once it's completely cool, you can put it in an airtight bag and it'll keep fresh for a few days. You can freeze it and then thaw it out and use it. So if you don't need both loaves, that's one thing you can do. Fresh bread does go stale faster. It's just going to, it doesn't have all those preservatives in it. What we typically do is we use it for sandwiches when it starts going stale. We will toast it for sandwiches or make things like grilled cheese. We want to go ahead and get it out of the pans quickly to let it cool, because again, you're going to get condensation. So let's do this. And I like to just set it on a cooling rack so it can come to room temperature. But I am going to break the rules and cut into this hot, because I've got kids who want a snack. Let's see. So there we have it. There's the crumb. As you can see, even though this is steaming hot, it is sliceable. It does not fall apart. This is a great sandwich bread. And it's also lovely just for eating. Y'all are gonna get some. I have a drooling audience on the other side of the camera. My most favorite, easy, simple, basic sandwich bread recipe. It is delicious, makes for great sandwiches, and makes for happy kiddos. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. God bless you. Until next time.